In a near-future nation stitched together by ceasefires and fragile agreements, Lila Noor, dismissed as deadweight, after a mission that left her body scarred and her conscience fractured, works invisible hours in the ministry's logistics wing. A delicate tattoo on her forearm, once a battlefield shorthand she never expected to show again, becomes the fulcrum of fate when General Marcus Hale, the architect of a covert targeting program, freezes at the sight of it. As old secrets flare and a violent conspiracy erupts within the garrison, Lila must decide whether to remain the quiet ghost she's been forced to be or to use the kill code inked into her skin to stop another atrocity. The story unfolds into a cinematic, morally complex thriller about agency and redemption, where power is as much about choices as it is about commands. And a single mark on the skin can change the map of a nation. The first time anyone called her deadweight was in a briefing room that smelled of cheap coffee and polished wood. The word had been spat with the precision of someone used to trimming liabilities. Layla had felt it like a cold coin placed into the palm, a small, heavy thing she carried back to her bunk and slept with, as if its weight could anchor her to something solid. Resignment, Colonel Soren had said, tapping a tablet with a practiced finger. We'll keep you here. Paperwork, manifests, coordinates, safe, predictable. Less exposure. An exposure in that language meant the rest of her hands that shook when the city screamed, her mouth that refused orders on the field, the thing she had done and refused to do. Exposure meant the old unit's memory, the nights with coordinate strings that built invisible fences of death, the sterile glow of a control room where a human face was a rectangle on a screen and a decision could tear a valley. They had a name for her kind of hesitation, liability. Deadweight. So she learned to move like a ghost. Lila learned the ministry's rituals by listening. How men in crisp uniforms came and went, how pens were lavished with attention over ink-stained hands, how the general never shook a subordinate's hand without checking their pupils first. She became the clerk who remembered the patterns of storms, the one who could find a lost manifest beneath a pile of old requisition slips. The work kept her from being noticed, and no one expected the quiet to hold a plan. The mark was beneath the sleeve of her uniform, a band of black and shaded dots that coalesced into nothing more to curious eyes than art. To Lila it was a ledger, a code, a memory of a winter in the desert when they had tattooed each other after a long mission. Idle hands making permanence of death. They called it the Nightingale patterns, an array of microdots and intersecting lines that, when scanned by authorized systems, unfolded into a kill matrix. Targets, times, nested permissions. It was a language of sanctioned annihilation, a place where a finger on a keyboard could hold an entire town's breath. She had tried to erase it once. Laser sessions in basements, creams that smudged the ink into a watercolor. The mark would not die, it only softened, like an old scar that refuses to disappear. It lived under the skin, under the deliberate dullness she displayed in the office. She kept it covered for the most part, but her sleeve had an unfortunate habit of bobbing when she reached for the communal kettle. Small exposures, tiny betrayals. On the day the general came, the barracks felt larger than usual, like a theater before the curtains. They had patched the marble in the foyer and placed new plants by the doors, as if green could soften the architectural lines of power. General Marcus Hale was a man built from angles, high cheekbones, a jaw that did not yield. His medals were not gaudy, but they caught the light in a way that reminded people to remember him. He had come to assess logistics, to make the predictable more orderly. Lila had seen him in passing, a billboard at headquarters, a silhouette against the city's new glass. She had practiced neutrality to the point of skill. When his entourage swept into the logistics wing, voices like well-drilled instruments She continued to stamp manifests and file them by the system's cold logic. A man in uniform laughed. A woman in a suit argued over container numbers. Hale moved like an observable law, and the room tightened itself into smaller breathing. He stopped at her desk because Captain Omar, who had seen her once in the field and whose face still showed the map of that mission, two faint scars by the jaw, had nodded toward her. "This one's sharp," Omar whispered, one of those small endorsements that could blur a person back into usefulness. General Hale did not nod to her at first. He looked at the stacks and the tabs, at the way the light struck the tablet at an angle, and then he looked at her hands. It was one of the small human gestures, a momentary error in the machine. He favored the hand he saw first. Her sleeve slid as she reached for the kettle, the fabric shoved back, revealing a sliver of ink. Time folded. Hale's face lost the practiced lines and became paper. The room's sound drained into a single dry gasp. The man who had once given orders to clear districts froze as if a visible string had been plucked, and the note had reached some old chord in his bones. He did not speak. He did not look at her. He looked at the ink with the intimacy of someone who had seen a thing he had thought buried. She felt his gaze like a weight. For a breath, she believed he might faint. Instead, he stepped back, a physical retreat that made the other officers straighten like people at attention. His eyes were not the cold machine of a strategist now. They hovered, haunted or horrified, she could not tell, and something like recognition flared. Lila, who had spent years teaching her face to be a blank sheet, felt a crack. Her throat held a history. She remembered the nights in the desert where the code had been recited like scripture, the slow ritual of compliance where a single string of coordinates translated into confirmation codes that slid through servers like knives. She remembered the crease of a practiced hand on a shoulder, the voice that taught them the kill codes. Theology. You do not decide the moral geometry you implement. You know what that is? Hale asked finally, and his voice was thin. It did not hold the authority of a general. It was a question asked by someone afraid of the answer. He asked it like a man testing whether ghosts wore the same uniform as the living. Captain Omar moved with the awkwardness of a man who had not wished to be the bridge. "It," he faltered, then stepped closer. "The Nightingale pattern. Old program. Decommissioned." The words hung between them like wet paint. Lila's fingers tightened around the kettle handle until the porcelain creaked. "You were in Nightingale," the general said. It was not an accusation so much as a reading. He looked at her as though by examining the mark, he could read the ledger beneath, like someone opening a book to the first page and thinking the end might be there. She considered lying. She had been a soldier. She had been trained in the economy of omission. But the lie would have been its own kind of death, and she had already been given that title by men who trafficked in absolutes. "Yes," she said. Her voice was small enough to fold. "I was." Silence tightened. A senior aide adjusted his tie, the small nervous twitch of bureaucracy, hearing a story arrive at the wrong moment. People glanced at one another and felt the possibility that a past they had left, layered like sediment, was now being brushed. "You were listed as discharged." The general's eyes flicked to his aide's tablet, as if reading the administrative record would soften the intimacy of the ink. "Medical." Lila let him read the truth in the way she breathed. "Trauma," she said. "I refused to target." Marble might have cracked then if stone could harbor empathy. In her mind, the reasons opened like bruises. A child on the periphery of the coordinate grid who ran into the wrong alley, a rooftop where laundry hung like confessions, a woman with a wrist twitching from a noise that sounded like the program's cadence. She had not hesitated because she feared death. She had meant to stop himself. She had meant to break a chain that had been built on a faith in numbers. They had labeled her dangerous for that, and then deadweight. Easier to keep the logistics tidy than to question who gave the coordinates. Hale's jaw tightened, and the past and present braided in a way that made him look smaller. He, too, had been part of those rooms once, in a way his metals could never fully explain. His face had been carved by the decisions others demanded of him, and sometimes the decisions were the ones he wished he could unmake in private. Why keep it? He asked, though he already had an answer. That permanence was a testament and also a torment. Layla gave him a small, private smile. Because sometimes the thing you cover is the only evidence you own that you are still human. They both understood that in separate ways. For Hale, human was a dangerous confession. For Lila, it was a weapon and a forgiveness. The conversation did not remain in the quietness of mutual recognition. The day held other machinations. News had come overnight. Rumors at first, a whisper network on the base about a rogue contractor and missing authorizations. The ministry's supply nodes had experienced anomalous pings. Several untagged drones had lingered in the northern corridor's flight path. They called it an incursion, a phrase meant to clean the edges of panic. Late that evening, when the sky outside was the kind of blue you could not trust, too saturated, like a watercolor left in the sink, alarms threaded through the ministry. Lights flashed. Men shouted into earpieces. The garrison moved like well-oiled machinery, but there were human noises there too. The coughs and expletives, the small prayers under the breath. Lila was finishing a manifest when Omar grabbed her arm and hissed, "Get to the command room, now!" The command room smelled of stale coffee and authority. Hale stood in the center with his aides, looking more like a man in the spotlight than he had all day. Screens mapped the city in grids and heat signatures and blinking icons. One of the icons that had previously been dark had begun to flicker, an unassigned drone coming online, pinging into the Nightingale signature. Lila felt the old ledger flex in the skin beneath her sleeve. The pattern had an actuating knowledge. It was a key and a language and a doorway. She could read the structure of commands the way a musician might read a score. The drone's handshake was old. It used the same handshake pattern that had been retired years ago, buried in the program's deep logs. Someone was trying to awaken a ghost. Unregistered signature, the analyst on the console said, matches Nightingale microarray. Omar's jaw drew in. He looked at Lila and then at the screen as if the space between them could be bridged by sight. "Lila," he said, Can you authenticate?" It was not simple. Authentication required authorities that had been scattered after Nightingale was closed, cryptographic fragments, rotating keys, the human element that tied them together. But the mark on Lila had never just been ink. It had been a mnemonic map. When field soldiers carried a pattern, they carried the mental software that could reconstruct a permission string. It was not exactly authorization, but it was knowledge. Knowledge that could, in the right hands, forge the illusion of authority. She could hear the memory clicking into place like a lock remembering the feel of a key after years of rust. The base's secure system would reject her by protocol. Her discharge showed up in every registry. But the drone was out of central clearance channels. Whoever moved it knew the signatures well enough to make it talk like Nightingale. "There's a back door," Layla said. "A ghost hand. I can try to speak in its tongue. Send it a negating sequence. Make it think it's been decommissioned." Hale looked at her with the kind of question that was practical and ethical all at once. If it works, the drone won't pose a threat. If it fails, it could pivot, escalate, she finished. It could go kinetic. There was a long, small moment when the decision became a simple equation: risk the woman they had called Deadweight, or cut off the possibility and accept the damage made. Men who had spoken of parameters and rules now spoke of gut. The choice itself was unclean. Bureaucracy was meant to not feel. Hale's voice, when he gave the order, was the voice that had directed war. Do it. Lila took her place at an auxiliary console that reeked of long shifts and burned coffee. The terminal welcomed her like a cold welcome mat. Her hands hovered for a beat over the keys. It felt like stepping into a pool after being out in the cold for a long time. The water shocked her into an old architecture. She began to type, not the sterile codes of the ministry, but a rhythm she had rehearsed in quieter rooms. The nightingale pattern unfurled in her memory like a worn map. Each dot of the tattoo corresponded to a node: input, verification, cadence. She hummed counted beats in her head as she assembled the negating sequence, a lullaby to an instrument that had once learned how to sing. Outside the command room, the base shuddered in the way of places that are both fortress and habitation. The floors seemed to smell of other people's fear, shoe leather, and antiseptic and cigarettes. No one noticed when her sleeve rode up. It was just a practical thing, wrists free for work. But she felt watched, as though every mark was a ledger being balanced. The drone's icon on the screen wavered. For a breath, everything seemed to hold, as if the city itself was listening. The ping slowed. The signature's fidelity faltered. Then, like a door that had been pried open, and then saw the light, it clicked into a new state. The drone declared itself offline. A cheer went up, brief, brittle. People clapped the way surgeons clap after a successful suture. Hale did not clap. He watched Layla with an expression that finally allowed something like gratitude to make its careful approach. "How did you?" He began, but the question was for the room, obviously rhetorical. He had asked the man who had been labeled Deadweight to move in a way that the bureaucracy could not sanction. He had asked her to do the thing she had been punished for, to use the pattern. "Because I remember how to be human in a machine's language," she said. There was no triumph in it, just a tired honesty. They did not have time to let the relief become something larger. The console flashed a new warning. An external feed had been routed through an internal server. Someone had attempted to inject a secondary sequence into the network, a scaffolding that could resurrect more than a single drone. It was a spiderweb, authorization packets layered across logistic nodes to conceal an order. Whoever had built it wanted the illusion of legitimacy, enough to mask a cascade. Hale's face moved through a series of emotions that would have been a map if you liked tracing scars. He looked angry, then afraid, then like a man who wanted to turn away from an old sin but saw its shadow in his own hands. "Who benefits?" Omar asked. He had been quiet all night, his voice like an instrument re-introduced to the score. Layla thought of the last operation she had refused. She thought of the coordinates and the faces. A child who had reached for a metal toy. A woman who stood in the threshold, and the way the satellite imagery had failed to show the texture of human life. She thought of the contractors, men in suits with two clean shoes and promises like glossy brochures. Power, she had learned, could be both a map and a razor. Someone who wants to create a crisis, she said. Someone who needs a body count to pass a law, to justify a sweep, to make real estate for themselves under the cover of security. There are always players like that. Contractors, Omar said softly. Companies that profit from remedial contracts. The general's hand went to his face, a motion like a man reaching for a steadying bar. "Then we stopped them," he said. Stopping them required more than a frustrated man with medals. It required knowledge, leverage, and the willingness to act outside the neat lanes of policy. Layla's ticket into the messy work was the very thing they'd tried to erase, her memory of how machines listened. They traced the packets and found a jump point in the northern industrial zone, an old satellite uplink disguised as a shipping relay. It was nested within legitimate logistics channels. An ugly joke. The system meant to feed and sustain could also be used to starve or strike. The feed was encrypted with a renewable key that cycled through fragments stored in a skein of shell companies. Whoever designed it had thought of obfuscation like a math problem, but they had not accounted for the human mind that had once mapped the problem by heart. "Can you get us in?" Hale asked. She had the image of that desert night again. She could see the faces around a map, young, tired, convinced. She had learned then that refusal is a rarity in groupthink. She had refused before and had been shelved. But the shelf had dulled nothing. It had only sharpened the need to act. "I can spoof the authorization," she said. "But once I'm in, they'll know someone's poking. We get one window, maybe two. If it's contractors, they will yank the nodes and burn the servers. Then we go while we can." Hale said. A's a team. Their team, assembled by necessity, moved like a band of misfits into a game that was both tactical and bureaucratic. Omar and a small security team drove out in a battered van. Hale issued orders that tasted like war. Layla's role would be inside, a ghost on the network, a woman with a thumb on a pulse. She sat at the console and aligned the micro dots she'd carried as narrative into a forged authority string. Her hands were steady. She was a woman of small, exacting revolutions. Her mind walked the old corridors as she worked. Back to the night she had refused. They had been told targets were hostile. She had seen a family instead. She had argued, then with the pretense of reason, and lost. That image had become a talisman proof of a choice she had made and paid for. She thought of the child from the rooftop and how easy it was to turn numbers into nothing. She thought, too, of how men like Colonel Soren had catalogued her refusal into a single word, deadweight. The word was an attempt at erasure. She would not allow it to stand. When they hit the node, it was more violent than they'd planned. Contractors did not lie down for the ministry. They defended their revenue streams like men guarding a vault. The uplink was protected by a team with badges and a few rough hands. The security team ran into a firefight that smelled of oil and metal and the flaring white of muzzle fire. Omar took a hit in the shoulder. Someone else bled on the concrete like a red ledger. Inside, Lila felt the network surge as scripts swiveled to detect the intruder. Her fingers flew. The nightingale pattern nested into the forged string, the two systems speaking as if long-lost lovers. She opened a channel and broadcast a negation across the contractor's stream. For a second everything hung. The contractor's servers paused as if considering a bribe. Then a voice came over the feed, clear, calm, businesslike. "Identify," it said. It was a voice that had been trained to be authority, an executive's timbre. Layla's mouth went dry. If she answered incorrectly, they would lock, and the contractors would isolate the node and perhaps trigger a kill sequence to protect their secrecy. She could have fabricated a corporate ID, but the web of aliases needed to be perfect. Instead, she spoke her name. It was an absurd act in a networked, anonymized war. A personal introduction, like a signature delivered on an ancient card. "Lila Noor," she said. "Former Nightingale." The microphone went silent for a heartbeat. Then, the voice on the line sighed in a way that sounded almost like recognition. "I didn't think. Who are you working for?" Hale snapped through the comms, voice iron. "Someone with money," the voice said. "Someone who wants a moment." "Woo." "Not your concern," the voice said. There was something like contempt in it now. "Be careful, General. You and your people were not meant to be on my ledger. We operate in the cracks." Hale's hand tightened on the console. "You will stand down." "You think you can order me?" the voice said. There was a small laugh, almost musical. "We've watched you make choices, General. We know what you weigh on a scale. We built this so you would have to decide." Lila understood then what they had meant by weigh on a scale. They were not asking for a body count for the sake of it. They were manufacturing a moral imperative, a spectacle to justify something larger. A clearing of property, a legislative overhaul, a market. They preyed on certainty. "We're here to stop you. Hale said, low. It was a declaration with the taste of a confession that he, too, could fight with a different kind of authority. The feed clicked off. The contractor sealed the node. Guns clattered, and the lobby filled with shouts. Omar's voice came through the line, ragged. Wool held them, but they rigged the uplink to a mobile satellite. They can reposition. The base's map suddenly felt like a chessboard with smoke over the squares. Layla's heart pounded in a rhythm she had learned to quiet. There was one move left, Die. If they could get into the contractor's ledger long enough to copy their back and to expose the contracts and the people, they might shift public perception. They might pry open the ready-made reasoning. Layla sent a packet that looked like a corset, a handshake, a deference. But sewn into it, she tucked the names that mattered, the executives masked by shell companies, the off-books ledger, the calibrations. The packet streamed out into the contractor's servers like a whispering daguerreotype, impossible to ignore. If it reached the right journalistic desks, the right watchdog lists, it would change the calculus. It was not the most elegant solution, but it was a democratic one. She was not offering blood. She was offering light. The contractors tried to cut them off, but the message had already leaked through a window they'd failed to see. The night manager in an adjacent relay, who had no love for contractors and who forwarded the packet as curiosity. Within minutes, the web darkened with the names. A journalist phoned. An NGO lit up a feed. The contractor's neat world of off-books started to unravel in public. When the shouting stopped and the contractors were escorted out under cuffs and cameras, and the ministry's PR team tried to spin a narrative of decisive action, Hale came to Lila with a migration of something like humility in his face. "You could have walked away," he said. It was not a question. He had meant the world of leaving, of hiding under another quiet nickname. He had meant the person he had earlier labeled Deadweight. To remain just that. She thought of the child on the rooftop and felt the old ache like an unbuttoned coat. "I couldn't stay quiet," she said. "That's what they count on." He extended a hand. It felt like a bridge. "You saved the base, and maybe more than the base." She took it. For a moment, it was simply contact. Then she felt something like recognition move across his palm. The aftertide was bureaucratic and stubborn. There were apologies that tasted little like absolution, letters that footnoted heroism and erased jargon, meetings convened to cleanse any association with Nightingale. Lila was offered credentials. Offers came from offices she had been told were beyond her reach. Some intended to harness her into new programs, turn the woman who had refused a target into a new tool. The offers baffled her. She had not become courageous to be rebadged. She realized the danger of trading one kind of use for another. The kill code on her arm had been both a confession and a chain. To wear it and be used by others for their ends would be to become a pawn in the very architecture she had tried to disrupt. When Hale finally sat with her in the quiet of his office, the low hum of the city beyond, he was not an emblem of power so much as a man who had been forgiven by circumstance. He had the look of someone who had seen the consequences of orders and found them bitter. "You can stay," he said. "Help us rewrite protocols. Train people who will be allowed to ask questions, to pause. We will reconstruct oversight." She watched him carefully. The offer was generous and might protect others. It might also entrench her into the same systems she hated. "I won't be a tool," she said. "I don't expect you to be. I expect you to be a guard." It was not the same as forgiveness, but it was something close, a chance to turn the small seat they'd forced her into a lectern. She accepted because she realized that to run away would not solve the things broken in the city. To stay might. It was a dangerous bargain, and she liked bargains that involved risk. Risk had been the only honest metric she'd ever had. In the months that followed, the pattern on her arm became less a code and more a symbol. She taught recruits that a mark on the skin did not make a man or woman an agent. Intention did. She fought to build processes where hesitation was not punished, where the word deadweight would be a relic. Some resisted. Men and women who had relied on certainty disliked a new architecture that welcomed doubt. There were others who found safety in it. Policies shifted like tectonic plates, slow, seismic. Sometimes at night she would trace that band of microdots and recall the desert's cold and heat. She would trace the line that had made a machine obey and imagine it as a river map instead, a set of ways in rather than ways out. The ink did not literally change, but she did. General Hale visited seldom, but always looked at her, as if asking whether she had kept the bargain. Each time she watched his face for the twitch of old habits, the flicker of a study that favored results over people. He had changed, in ways that were visible only in the small acts, an inquiry that favored a dissenting voice, a pause before a clearance. He had not transformed into saintliness. He had merely admitted that power could be accountable. The world beyond their ministry remained complicated. Men and women who once trafficked in certainty would continue to find ways to shape the map. But Lila had learned that the body could hold contradictions. The mark on her arm carried what it had always carried, and what it had always meant was mutable. It was a ledger of yesterday and the skeleton of tomorrow. She had been labeled deadweight, but she had also become a hinge. One afternoon, years later, a young recruit who had been sharp in an interview and soft in a way that reminded Lila of herself sat across from her. The recruit's hand trembled when she reached for a cup of tea. She did not notice the sleeve slip, and for a breath a sliver of patterned ink flashed. Lila did not startle. She had learned the economy of small shocks. She simply smiled and reached out as if to steady the hand. The recruit looked up, startled to be touched. "It's okay," Lila said. "You can carry what you carry here. We will teach you how to use it, and also how to refuse. Some lessons cannot be cataloged in manuals." The recruit asked about the tattoo, eyes wide, curious and fearful, like a child edging toward the edge of a well. Lila traced the air above her forearm with the reverence of someone who reads maps. "It used to be a code to kill," she said. "Now it's a reminder to ask why." Outside, the city held its breath and exhaled in the unspectacular way of inhabited places. The general's policies rolled forth in small, bureaucratic motions, which is the way things that change the world usually move. Through memos and human stubbornness, through the slow baptism of practice. People would still make choices that tilted the scales. Some would still try to profit off fear. But the ledger had a new entry. A woman who had been called deadweight had refused to be silenced. She touched the tattoo as if acknowledging an old debt. It had been her worst inheritance and her brightest talisman. The ink on her arm, once a kill code and a scar, had become its own kind of redemption. Proof that nothing written into the skin could fully map the heart's motion. The general, when he passed the doorway later, would glance and then look away, as if granting a private courtesy to a colleague and a confession to a friend. The world would continue to be a place where numbers and faces collided. But Lila had learned the architecture of both, and she had altered one small thing, the emphasis. Power would now be measured by who could pause, who could name the child behind the coordinates, who could call a stop when the machines proposed a righteousness they had no right to claim. She was no longer called deadweight. Occasionally someone would still whisper the label in old corridors where men kept their archives of reputation. Sometimes the word landed on her like an old summer's rain, brief, negligible. She had enough life now to take it in stride. Late, when the office had emptied and the city's lights simmered, she would sometimes roll her sleeve and read the dots, not as commands, but as braille for a conscience. She would press her thumb against the ink like a finger on a page and remember the general's frozen face, the way recognition had looked when a past collided with the present. Recognition, she had learned, could be its own kind of salvation.